Thank you for joining us for this recorded webinar. This webinar features ideas from Todd Stanley's book, Project-Based Learning for Gifted Students, a Handbook for the 21st Century, available from proofrock.com.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel McIntosh. Welcome to our webinar. I sure appreciate the time that you've taken to be here. I know that many of you, this is the end of your school day and you are tired, and I appreciate you coming on over and watching our webinar on project-based learning. I wanted to mention we have folks from all over the world attending. Let me list off a few of uh, the different locations that people are signing in from. We've got the United Kingdom, South Africa, Italy, Australia, Germany, Kuwait, China, Colombia, Canada, Switzerland, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and of course, folks from all over the United States. So thank you for attending. I appreciate it. Let me tell you a little bit about the Zoom interface. If you'll notice at the bottom, there's a Q&A box. If you will use that box for posing questions to Todd Stanley, our speaker today, that'll be great, because then I can sort of, as we are talking and presenting in the webinar, I can shoot your questions over to Todd. He can answer them live as we go. So find that little Q&A box, click it, and you'll be able to type your questions into that box. As a reminder, we can't see you, we can't hear you. This is a one-way communication, a webinar, so you'll be able to see and hear us. I'd like to introduce one of my editors, Stephanie McCauley. She'll be fielding some of the questions, and then let me introduce our speaker, Todd Stanley. Todd is an author of more than 12 of our books. Let me shoot you over to our website real quickly so you can see what Todd has done. If you'll go to our website and type in Todd Stanley here in the search box, you'll see all of the books that he's written. The one we're going to focus on today is primarily this project-based learning for gifted students, a handbook for the 21st century. A lot of the content that we're going to be talking about today is covered in this book, but Todd's also done a lot of other great books for us. There are projects for the math classroom, projects for language arts. He's done science classroom, STEM. He's also done a whole book on rubrics. And then his newest book, which is just out this season, is promoting rigor through higher level questioning. So let me tell you a little bit about Todd. Let me get my screen back. Todd is a classroom teacher for more than 18 years. He's a national board certified teacher. He is the gifted services coordinator at Pickerington local school district in Ohio. He is also an adjunct at the University of Cincinnati. So thank you for joining us, Todd. Let me start the questioning out a little bit with you. Tell us a little bit about how you came to project-based learning and what is project-based learning?
Sure. So I would say I came to projects first, because there is a distinction between projects and project-based learning. So when I first started teaching, like most teachers, I was just trying to get my hands on anything I could to teach kids. So I had a textbook that I relied a lot on. I was very traditional in front of the classroom teacher. I had traditional assessments. But every once in a while, I would throw in a project here or there. And so what would happen is when kids would come back a couple years later, they were visiting from the high school, they'd come by and they said, Mr. Stanley, I remember. And it was always one of the projects. It was never, hey, I remember that time that you did a worksheet with us, or I remember the time that you lectured to us, or whatever. It was always a project. And I'm like, well, the projects are what's really sticking with them. And so why don't I do more of them? And so I started to do more projects. And I got to the point where at the end of my time in the classroom, I was completely project-based learning. In project-based learning, the big difference, and I'll show you the difference here in this visual here. Let's see here, pull it up, is it's basically the control that you as the classroom teacher are willing to give of the students. So that's the big difference. In projects, students are just given a project, and it's like kind of like creating a widget where they are, here's what I'm asking you to give me, here's the amount of time and resources I'm giving you, and then you need to give me this product at the end. And because of that, there's not a ton of creativity and choice that students have in projects. And project-based learning, it's more student-directed. The projects are more teacher-directed. The project-based learning, what I would say to students is, I want you to learn about A. Pick whatever means you want to show me that you learned about A, and that will be your assessment on whether you got it or not. And so you can choose anything you want. And I would give them I had menu boards that I would use that kind of look like this. This is an example of one of the menu boards that I use with students. So I would give them a lot of choices. Sometimes I would just give them a few choices depending. But one thing I wanted to always have for students is the choice to choose something that I didn't have for them. I felt like sometimes menu boards, as great as they are for sparking ideas, they also limit kids to what your own imagination and creativity are. And so I wanted kids. So I had a kid one time that when we were working on a project, and he's like, "Mr. Stanley, I'd like to make a video game concerning this." And it was physical versus chemical change. I'm like, "How can you make a video game on that?" And this was a C student for me. He wasn't like a great student. He was a average student, not because of his ability, but he just wasn't much engaged in class and in any of his classes for that matter. And he made this spectacular video game where this knight goes on a journey and is doing different tasks like cutting down a tree with his sword. Is that a physical or chemical change? You had to answer that. And if you got it right, you moved on. And so that student, like, it was a real epiphany for me. Like, I should not be limiting my students to my own imagination. I should allow them to do some of that stuff themselves. And so he taught me a valuable lesson on that. The other thing that project-based learning is also giving over the control. As the teacher, a lot of times we feel like we have to be in control of our classrooms. And when it comes to discipline and management, you absolutely do have to be. But when it comes to content and learning styles, it does not have to be. And that took a while for me to understand that I don't have to be the one that is the bringer of all knowledge. I can simply show them how to find that themselves. And then what you get by doing that is they find things you didn't even intend for them to find, but they're really amazing things and really great learning experiences. But because again, I'm not limiting them to my scope. They're using their own vision to find out what they need to find. So project-based learning is more student-directed, less sage from the stage, more guide from the side. And actually, to steal a phrase that I've heard recently is, I think the project-based learning, you're more meddler in the middle, where you get to go and you get to ask questions of students and kind of stir up the pot a little bit and get them thinking, and then you kind of leave them in that mess to try to figure out, to try to problem solve. But that's kind of the idea of project-based learning, is it's all about problem solving. It's about critical thinking. It's about being creative. It teaches so many 21st century skills that you can't teach with just content. Because the realization I came to I was a social studies teacher for many years, but I've taught science, I've taught English and math in lower grades. But what I realized is that content is moot. So what I mean by that is, if a kid forgets something I taught them in my social studies class when it comes to a date or a name or something of that, they're going to be just fine in life. They're not going to get to their job interview and they're not going to say, "Hey, you can have this job as long as you can tell me the name of the tigers and the twin rivers in Mesopotamia." They're never going to be asked that. So I knew that kids would be okay if they didn't learn their content necessarily, but I knew they would be in a whole world of hurt if they didn't learn skills. So I combined the two in projects by taking the content and having them use skills to learn that content. And so I felt like I was getting kind of the biggest bang for my buck, because students were learning the content, but at the same time, they were learning how to publicly speak. They were learning how to research. They were learning how to collaborate with others. They were learning all these really valuable 21st century skills that if you ever put in a Google search, what are the biggest skills employers are looking for, what you'll get is what project-based learning teaches. Which is what I talked about: the critical thinking, the problem solving, the being able to adapt to things, the leadership, all those things they'll learn in project-based learning. And so I really felt like my kids were not, it's that Confucian saying of, you give a kid a fish, you give someone a fish, they eat for a single day. But if you teach them to fish, they'll eat the rest of their lives. I felt like in my class, I was teaching kids to fish. Rather than giving them that fish, like in a lot of traditional classrooms. And so because they learned how to fish, I knew with utmost confidence they would leave my class and be fine, because they knew how to learn on their own now. And so, but part of that, again, is like giving them the autonomy and the space to do that. Because as a teacher, it can be difficult to give that over sometimes. Especially if you set up your classroom very traditionally at first, it's hard to transition to that. And that was probably the biggest transition for me. But once I did it, it was so much more rewarding to do it the way of having the kids, drive the learning. And it's so much more rewarding for them as well.
Yeah, that makes sure sense. But Todd, we had a few questions from people who were going to be attending, and they emailed us with some questions. And Stephanie, I think you were going to field some of those questions that before we start taking audience questions. And I would like to encourage the audience to use that Q&A box and ask some questions. But Stephanie, let me turn it over to you a bit.
Yeah, so building on what you were talking about, Todd, how does the role of the teacher change once you make the classroom more student-directed?
So what I would say is, real quick, actually, I'm going to go back for just a second. So when it comes to projects, the reason why projects, I think for me, no matter what I'm teaching, no matter what content area, no matter what grade, I have to have a structure that kind of is like the skeleton of the class. And it fleshes itself out wherever it needs to, but the skeleton is still there to keep it sturdy and keep it going. And so this was my structure, these steps to a project. And I got these steps to a project not by looking at educational research, but looking at business books. So I was reading a bunch of business books on project management. I would get them from the library and I'd read them, and they would say, well, this is what you need to do to run your, and I was like, why don't I run my classroom like a project manager in a business? Because that's what kids are going to see when they get out in the real world. They're going to be working on projects. They're going to, be having to do those things. So I developed these steps from these business books of defining the problem, which in a lot of cases your content standard, your solution option, or what are what are you going to do to show me you learn what you learn? And then what you see there for number 5 is monitor and control progress. And that is probably the biggest difference between a traditional and a project-based learning. So in project-based learning, you are more coaching rather than you're teaching. So again, you're not giving kids information. You are showing them where to get it for themselves. And you're teaching them how to find resources that are good and how to avoid resources that are bad. I'll give you an example. Like I have a lot of teachers that will say you absolutely cannot use Wikipedia. And my philosophy was always like, I want to teach you how to use Wikipedia, responsibly, because there is some good information on Wikipedia. So rather than just cutting it off completely, I want to teach you how to look for the notations and the resources and click on those and see if they're reliable or not. So I would rather teach them that than just a blanket statement of this is what you can or cannot do. And that's part of the coaching. So one thing that you do when you're coaching in a project-based learning classroom is managing stress. It can be stressful because a lot of project-based learning is group work. I will say, I don't like the term group work necessarily as opposed to collaborating. So the idea of putting students in groups is that they can produce something better as a whole than they could have by themselves. And I always said to myself, if kids could do better on their own, I should just have them working on their own. And sometimes I would do that for projects, but a lot of times they were working in groups. So managing stress is one of those things, and giving them the ability to troubleshoot when something comes up rather than me having to manage that all the time. So, and also making sure that kids who are, because some kids, you put them on a project and they go to town on it, and you don't need to interfere with them or talk with them or anything, because they're really excited and engaged in the work, and they're going to be doing that. There are other kids that you have to scaffold the process, and otherwise they're going to get overwhelmed. Like if you have I had a kid who had ADHD. He could not focus on a long-term project. So I had to break it down day by day what that looked like. So this is what you're going to be doing today. So that I was creating like puzzle pieces. And eventually he was going to put those puzzle pieces together into an entire project. Some students see the entire puzzle for what it is, and they're able to pick and choose what they're going to work on. And so that's part of the managing the stress of students, managing the stress of parents, making sure that parents know you're doing project-based learning. Because it's very unfamiliar to a lot of parents. It's because I often would get this, it's not school like I used to have. And I'm like, exactly. Why would you want school to be 30 years old? You don't like a cell phone that's more than 5 years old. So why would you want school that was like when you went to school? So we're kind of rolling with the times, although project-based learning has been around for a long time. And so informing parents, I always send out emails saying, this is what we're working on this week. If you want to help your child, here are some things you could do to help, because ultimately that's what parents want to do. They just want to help their child. But it looks different in projects because they can't sit down and do the project for the kid. Matter of fact, a lot of times I would have kids do the projects in class as opposed to taking it home for that very reason. Because if I sent it home, it would come back and it would be like, it would like be done by an engineer, and it turned out that the kid's dad was an engineer and he had done it. So I also wanted to see the process myself of the learning going on. So if I had a project where students were working on something, the expectations that they were working on in class, so I could see what was going on and be able to guide them if I needed to guide them. So managing stress is one thing. Giving students space is another one. So what I mean by this is that you definitely don't want to micromanage students. There are some students, as I said before, that can really handle the independence of project-based learning. And so because they can handle that, you give them space to do so. So I may check in a very brief check-in once or twice a week. Like, how are things going? Do you need anything from me? What are you thinking about this? And then there are other kids I had to conference with every day. But the nice thing about project-based learning is that you have the ability to do that. When I was leading the class as the teacher, I was talking at the class as a whole. I wasn't having individual conversations with students. Project-based learning allowed me to take myself from the front of the classroom and put me in seats in front of my students and having those conversations. So that was amazing to be able to have those conversations, because you can really tell what a kid knows. The third thing that you have to do when you're doing project-based learning is keep kids focused on the goal. It's very easy. I mean, projects are shiny objects. Let's be honest. They're a lot of fun a lot of times. And kids get caught up in the fun and the shininess of the object to the point where they're not learning what it is you want them to learn. To give you an example, when I was teaching kids how to do perimeter, and this is one of the projects in the math book, I believe, I had them design a fort, and then they had to have the perimeter of the fort, and they could design anything they wanted. So they could have a pool in their fort. They could have multiple levels, multiple rooms. I had a kid had a trampoline room. And so all sorts of really cool ideas. And then I always offer my kids bonus opportunities, which are things, they're not extra credit, but they're just, if you want to challenge yourself a little bit more, here's this bonus opportunity. So in this case, I said, if you want to build a model of your fort, you can do that. And, and we'll take a look at that. And so this kid comes in and he has made a fort out of popsicle sticks that is just amazing. Like, you feel like you could live in it. It's so detailed. And I said to him, this is great. What's the perimeter of it? He's like, perimeter? He had lost sight of what he was supposed to be doing, which was learning perimeter. And so what I started doing, and this is in the project-based learning book, is I would use contracts to keep them on task. I would use calendars to keep them on task, to say, this is a 3-week project. Let's break it down day by day what you're going to be doing. And what happens then is it teaches them time management skills, because they can look at their calendar and say, I'm here, I should be here. And how do I get to here? What do I have to do to make up for that? Or they might be ahead of the game. And kids always said, well, Mr. Stanley, I'm ahead, so I can stop doing it. I'm like, no, you just move on to the next thing. And it gives you more time to improve and make your project better. And so students were learning how to manage their time. And this is third graders that were learning. I taught everything from third grade to seniors in high school. And I know from having 2 kids myself that time management is really difficult for some kids, especially gifted kids. And so by doing project-based learning, I felt like they were learning time management skills. And so a fourth thing that you need to be able to do, and I talked about this already, is it allows you to conference with students, but it's important that you do that. So you could get kids started on a project and then sit at your desk and grade papers, or, answer emails. But that's a prime opportunity for you to have those conversations with kids. So I was always, when I started class and started the project and kids got working on it, then I was moving around from table to table to table, having those conversations. Sometimes I didn't have anything to do because I'd had the conversations already with them and I knew they were where they needed to be. So in that case, then you don't have to be so focused on the conversation, but you have to be willing to do that and to talk with your students about where they are and to challenge them. I mean, these are not just gifted kids, but any kids can be challenged. So is there something you can do to kind of push them to that next level? I've always thought that teaching is about getting kids to take risks. And are you allowing them, are you prodding them or giving them opportunities to take risks so that their learning is much more powerful? And that's what you can do when you're conferencing with your students. The last thing that's important, because project-based learning a lot of times does involve collaboration, but not everyone, including adults, know how to collaborate really well. And so I spent the first 2 weeks of my school year actually training kids how to work in groups, what group work looks like, what successful group works like. We would make norms as a class. So these are the expectations. We talked about problems that may come up and how you troubleshoot those problems. So by laying this groundwork, when kids got work, I didn't lay this groundwork at first, and it was a disaster. Like kids would get in groups, they get fights, parents are emailing me, calling me, all this stuff. But by training them in this group work, it made the year so much smoother, where I wasn't getting those phone calls and emails about kids not working well in groups, because kids were learning how to work in groups themselves. They could troubleshoot for themselves. And I gave them a little bit of rope to, at times, if there was a problem that I was developing, I kind of observed it from afar, but tried to let them manage that problem. A lot of times as teachers, we feel like our job is to make sure we stop problems before they start. In my opinion, you want those problems to start a little bit so that they know how to cope with those problems and how to deal with those problems, especially gifted kids who are not used to challenge. Some kids are not used to challenge because it comes so easy to them. Having them being able to use that grit that Angela Duckworth talks about, and overcome that is going to be really powerful for them. So training them in group work is going to be really important. So those, I would say, those are the things when it comes to coaching students in the classroom. I always stopped calling myself a teacher and said I was the project manager. And that's what I was doing, is I was managing the project. And they were doing the learning. I was not doing the teaching. Teaching is a very verb term, where I'm teaching kids, but actually they're learning. I want them to be learning rather than me teaching them. So
that makes sense. Hey, Todd, can you go back to the slide that has the steps to project-based learning?
Happy to. Yep.
So I had a question on one of those. So that number 2, develop solution options. What can you tell me about that?
Sure. It's just a fancy business term for what are you going to show me that proves that you learn what you learn. So it's the product, basically. So when I give them that menu board, what are they going to choose to show me? What avenue, what venue, what product are they going to use to show me? It could be something physical. It could be a presentation. It could be a website. It could be all sorts of things. But sometimes I would give kids that. I would say, here's what I want you to produce, but I would give them choice within that. So like, for instance, I had a mousetrap project where I told kids your end solution option is to create a mousetrap that doesn't hurt the mouse. But I had 30 kids in a class. They would come up with 30 different mousetraps. So I wasn't prescribing how that was to be done. Other times I would say, I want you to learn about the American Revolution, and you're going to teach the class what you learned. And so that might be the solution option. Other times I would give them free rein. You can do whatever you want to show me that you learn what you learned. And some students that were more traditional chose really traditional ways to do that. And kids that were more adventuresome and more willing to take risks would do that. And they would kind of take it upon themselves to try something that was out of their comfort zone, which I think is really important. So
makes sense. Stephanie, for some of the other questions that we'd received before this webinar.
So a big question we often get is, how do you assess project-based learning? So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure, that's an excellent question. And what I would say when it comes to assessing students is, I talked about those calendars and contracts. Part of that is also having a rubric. So I would oftentimes either make the rubric myself, or I would work the class and I would make it together. And I always felt the rubric was your blueprint. So if you wanted an A, that rubric told you what you needed to do to get an A. If you wanted, maybe you weren't so concerned about getting an A, it told you what the bare minimum that you had to do. But the way I made my rubrics is, and I often struggle with this with some people, is they're like, well, if they meet the assignment, they get an A. My philosophy was always like, if they meet the assignment, they're at a B or C range. They've not excelled. They've just given you the level that you asked them. If you want an A, you've got to earn it. And so in the top of the rubric with the A or the excellent, or however I term that, was going to be something that was above and beyond what the general expectation was, especially because these were gifted students a lot of times I was working with. And so using these rubrics is really important. It's also important to write objective rubrics. So what I always tell people when they're writing their own rubrics is, you need to be able to know what it looks like in the classroom. So if you said a kid gave a great presentation, what does a great presentation look like? It means that they spoke well so you could hear them. It means they didn't put their hands in their pockets. It means that they looked at the audience, not in a creepy way, but still in a way that was appropriate. And so I wanted that in the rubric, and rather than student gave a great presentation, I would have a presentation title and say, what did that look like? And so students could say, if I want to do a great presentation, I got to make sure my volume is there. I got to make sure I'm making eye contact, and I've got to make sure that I'm doing what it says in the rubric. And so using like something like Rubistar, which is an online rubric maker, don't do that, because when you put those in, they make very general rubrics. And so their rubrics will literally say, student did a poor job, student did a good job, student did a great job. My question is always, what does that look like? Because what is great to you might not be great to me. So this lets the students know what the teacher expectations are. I got to the point where I had students working on so many different projects that I couldn't possibly make that many rubrics. So I trained my kids how to make rubrics themselves. And so I did this with third graders, by the way, because people were like, well, this will work with high school. It works with my third graders are making really good rubrics. I taught fifth and sixth grade science. And the principal came into me one time. She's like, I really like the rubrics that you're making. Can you come in to our staff meeting and show them how to make rubrics? Well, we know how staff meetings are. No one's paying attention. It's the end of the day. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to bring my fifth and sixth graders in, and they're going to teach them how to make the rubrics. And so I brought 5 fifth and sixth graders, and you've never seen a more attentive teaching staff at the end of the day that was at that meeting, because the kids were there. And they were like, oh, we need to actually act like teachers, not like the buffoons that we are when we stop teaching. And so my fifth and sixth graders taught them how to make rubrics. And it was just, and I wasn't the one doing it. They just learned how to do that, and they were doing that. So, writing a really objective rubric, and I'm not trying to sell one of my books, but I do have a book on using rubrics and how to make those. But regardless of the book, what I would say is you just need to make sure that it's your own rubric, that it's a rubric that makes sense to you, that it shows students what they need to do. And I often would make it together with my students so that they had some kind of skin in the game. They were making expectations. They were aware of the rubric because they helped create it. Sometimes you give them that rubric, they don't even glance at it. But if they're making it themselves, they're aware of what's in that rubric. So.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me grab to address a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A box, and feel free, attendees, to shoot us a few questions. We love those. Rachel's asking about PBL in a pull-out setting. She's got the kids for maybe 30, 45 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. Is it workable in that kind of a setting?
Yeah, I will say yes. I mean, and I say that from experience, not from theory. So I had a pull-out class. I had them 1 day a week. I had them all day, and I had them 1 day a week during the 5 days. And so I was doing project-based learning, and kids had a lot of choice. But what I found was, if students were working on their project and then left for the week, when they came back, they oftentimes forgot what they were working on, or they didn't get done what they were supposed to be doing. So this is where calendars really came into play, where kids made a calendar for the entire week. And my directive to, and this was 3rd and 4th graders I was doing this with, my directive was, you need to work at least 15 minutes a day on your project. So they would decide what they were going to do. It might be reading, it might be doing some research, it might be whatever, but the calendar kept them on task. And then when they came in the next week, I didn't say, how's your project? I said, pull out your calendar and let's see where you are. And if kids were where they needed to be, then boom, they just picked up where they left off and were working on their project. And if kids weren't, then I coached them and how to manage their time better, or how to make sure that they were. And I was, by doing this, I always found that the kids came into the pull-out program, and they were engaged because they remembered what it is that they were doing, because they had that calendar to use as a reference point. If you're taking them a couple of days a week, again, the calendar is going to be really helpful, and a contract as well. The contract lists what are the learning objectives, and the contract and calendar and rubric are all in that project-based learning book, how to make those, or templates of those. And so by using those, it really keeps kids focused even when they're not in your class, because I know it can be tough when you're pulling kids out just for 30, 40 minutes a day. But you could work on a 3-week project over the course of 3 weeks, each time they're getting together. What you don't want is the first 15 minutes is them getting reacclimated with the project. You want them to be able to start the project right where they left off, so that they're able to get more accomplished.
No, that's great. Paul, so if those of you who want to hear good praise for Todd Stanley, if you go to the Q&A box, one of our attendees, Paul, has given you quite a compliment, and linked to a review that he wrote on Library Thing of your your authentic learning and real world experiences that build 21st century skills. So Paul, thank you for that, those
Yeah,
kind
thank you,
words.
Paul.
Yeah, yeah.
Appreciate
And then we had one anonymous attendee who was asking, what, I'm going to read it directly. What type of criteria did you set for choosing the projects, or do you? I'm sorry. Do you? I'm sorry. I muddled that.
You're fine.
She's asking, do the kids get to choose the projects, and what are the parameters for choosing those projects? And if not, do you choose the projects?
Sure. So I'm going to take you to a visual here. Let me take it. That kind of shows this idea. Hold on, let me share. All right. I always felt like with projects, it was a backwards building process. So when you look at the backwards building process that you see here, the first step is to identify what you want to accomplish. For me, that was always the content standard. People always are like, well, I can't do project-based learning because I have to teach these content standards. But they're not exclusive of one another. They work together. So by basing your project on a content standard, then that is, the kids are going to be getting that content standard. So I would choose the content standard, but the kids would choose how they were going to show me what they learned or how deep they were going to go in. The one thing I really liked about project-based learning, especially, is that, especially working with gifted kids, is differentiation is really hard. I mean, let's be honest. We use that word like it's a secret sauce that we just pour on kids and all of a sudden we differentiate. But it's really difficult. Even in a gifted classroom, you have a variety of kids from a 132 IQ to a 147 IQ that are at different ends of spectrums. And so project-based learning, I felt differentiated really well because kids can come in where they're at. So if a kid already is so you're starting a project, a beginner is at A, they can start the project there. If you have a kid that's already at G, they can start there and take the project from there. If you have a kid who's an expert and is already at W or X, they can start there. And so kids can start wherever they're at. And so that's the beautiful thing about it, is they can take it as far as they want to. And some kids will turn in something that's just a basic idea of the project, which is fine. And then some kids will create something that you didn't even intend because they're able to handle. I had a kid, he knew more about space than I ever cared to know about space. And I was like, I can't really teach him anything in this unit that he doesn't already know. So I challenged him to create a project where he was teaching the class something he was interested in knowing about. So he learned all about black holes and taught the class about black holes. And so it was something that he was really engaged in. And it got to get him at the level of his ability. So determining the product is where I let the kids figure out what is the product going to be. Sometimes I give that to them. Sometimes I'll give them ideas. Sometimes, but a lot of times I'll let them choose what that so determining the product is where the kids come into play. So the teacher identifies what you want to accomplish. And then the planning is how you develop this product is again on the students. So how are you going to make this product? How are you going to manage your time? So the first part of this backwards building process is definitely on the teacher. Although I will say there are times that I didn't give them the content standard and I used inquiry-based learning to get to that. And what was always interesting is the kids came to the content standard naturally without you having to tell them that. But they felt like they were having a say-so in what they were learning. Like, this is what I really want to learn. It's like, that's what I wanted you to learn anyways. I came to that. So, so like, for instance, when I was teaching the American Revolution, rather than saying, here are the things I need you to learn about the American Revolution, I would say, what are some things you want to learn about the American Revolution? And kids would throw out ideas. And then I would say, okay, who wants to work on, the Declaration of Independence? And the kids were like, here's 5. Great, you're a group. Go work on that. Who wants to work on the Articles of Confederation? And 3 kids would say, great, you go work on that. So we were still learning about the American Revolution, but kids were like, oh, we're driving the learning. We're really the ones calling the shots here. When in reality, I would have taught those things anyways. They just came to them. So I use that backwards building process whenever I'm creating a project, and I do that in my books. I start with the end in mind, and then I work it backwards. And I talk about that in several of the books. I actually even start my calendar at the end and work and build backwards so I get to my first day. So I start at the end of a project when it comes to that.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. Sue is asking something that came up in the last webinar that we ran. Since there's so much group work involved in the way that you've described it, can this be adapted to use in a homeschool setting with just one child?
Absolutely. So it's funny. I said in the last webinar as well, the egomaniac that I am, every once in a while I will Google myself and just to see where my name is popping up. And I pop up on a lot of homeschool pages. So people are using my project-based, and I've had people leave reviews too, like, I homeschool my child, I use the project-based learning or the projects here to do that. And so I would say, even if you're not collaborating, the student is still going to, you're still going to give them choice, autonomy. They're just not going to get to bounce ideas off of other people necessarily. So it doesn't have to be exclusive to groups. Kids can work on projects by themselves and still get the project-based learning experience. The main part about the project-based learning part is that you're giving them choice. You're allowing them to make choices in what they're doing, giving them some autonomy to do the work. And so that's kind of the big part of the project. It doesn't have to be group work. There are often projects I would do in my project-based learning classroom that were individual. And then they would jigsaw it together. So they would work on it individually. And then, like, we did a Native American museum. So each kid worked on their own exhibit. And then we just put it all together as a giant museum. And we invited other classes to come in to see that. We invited parents to come in to see that. And kids went around and saw their own exhibit. Because in today's day and age, it's so difficult to go on a field trip, like getting a bus, getting the medical forms, getting all the meds kids are taking. It's really hard to take them on a field trip. So I was always like, let's just bring the field trip here. We'll create our own. And so we created the museums for Egypt, for Native Americans. We did other things that were kind of like that as well, where kids were experiencing something without having to go there necessarily.
That's great. That's great. I had one question from Rachel, but Rachel, I'm going to answer that in the wrap up in just a moment. So if you'll be patient, I'm sorry, we're out of time. If you'll let me thank Todd Stanley. Todd, you've been so gracious to join us. I sure do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, if I could share just one thing real quick, that's okay. So I do want to. We're in a collaborative profession, and so it's really important to collaborate with others. So I do want to just show you guys where my web page is, because there's a lot of free resources on there. And there are, if you go right here is what it looks like. I always like to show this too because my daughter designed this. But on here under resources, there's a bunch of free resources available, including the templates for making project-based learning, including some projects here or there that are not in the books. So feel free to use that as a resource. I also have, my blogs, all that stuff is free. There is a part that has my books on there as well that will link you back to Amazon or to Proofrock. And so that's just a resource to be able to use. So
that's great. Are some of the slides, or at least the information that you provided in this, available as resources?
Yes, under the resources. I don't have all my presentations there, but I do have a lot of them there. So if you want to roll through certain slides, like I teach I do a workshop on STEM and project-based learning and how they go together. And there's a slide, there's a PowerPoint in there that you can download for free. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thanks a lot, Todd. I sure appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.